first things first, what is the Internet of Geosensing? And being a modern talk, I used ChatGPT, went in and asked it what the Internet of Geosensing is. And honestly, I've only mentioned this in public a few times and may have written about it once or twice, but nevertheless, ChatGPT came up with that definition for me. And honestly, if I'd sat down for 3 days thinking about it, I couldn't have done a better job. I was frankly quite shocked, and what it also did was reveal the power of large language models to me at that point in time. I was frankly gobsmacked. I'm not going to read it out to you, but if you just read through it yourself, that is exactly the point of what we're talking about of the Internet of Geosensing, and these are some of the things I'm going to be talking about in the course of this talk. I've shown you this slide before, people have seen this presentation, but the other thing we like to do is to separate IOG, the Internet of Geosensing, from IoT. We've already heard the term IoT mentioned a few times today. This is actually an old slide which was presented at this event in 2015, which grabbed our imaginations, and it was, who was it there? It was David Rose at the time, talking about value drivers in mining, and he separated things out to what we would call things related to the Internet of Things, break temperatures, wear rates, things like that, which you could optimise. But he made the point that the biggest value drivers, the biggest levers, were attached to spatial and ore body factors. And to put it in our terminology, all about the bloody rocks, right? Not necessarily about the trucks. And no one measures those things. So why don't people respond to the spatial variability in deposits, which have the biggest value driver levers attached to them? Because those things typically are not measured in mining operations in sufficient detail or in a timely enough fashion. So we separate what we do away from the IoT into the IOG. Now, a couple of drivers in the background industry, people have spoken about this stuff already today. We've heard that we need to find more metals for decarbonising and transition. You've seen that graph before, but the reason I'm showing the copper demand curve is that's actually changed in the last 3 months even. It had a deficit appearing around now, but with the contraction of economic activity in China, which is going on right now, the demand for copper is actually reducing, and the rate that the demand for that copper is reducing is exceeding the rate that we're using more copper right now for the energy transition. But that is not going to be the case forever. Eventually that supply chain will flip around and copper will go into deficit. So I show you that because we need to do a better job, and I think the role of the Internet of Geosensing allows us to do a better job to find the materials that we need and then to extract them efficiently. Sometimes that comes under the banner of resource stewardship. And just not to leave our gold comrades not mentioned here, I feel for the gold companies at the moment, they're not getting much airtime, including at conferences. They're not seen as being very sexy, but they have their own issues coming up, and they have a problem with their proven and probable reserves. This graph is a few years old, but they're about to fall off a cliff. So if they want to keep their balance sheets in good nick and supply a non-fiat store of currency and wealth into the world, then they need to get on their horses as well and need much the same technology, but for a different outcome. I was looking for examples to use to illustrate the value of geological information, geosensing, and I was sitting at home last week and I watched Four Corners, and there was a story about the story about the Snowy Hydro 2 project. Now, and what a story this is. Honestly, I almost fell out of the seat by the end of the show. So you will know some of these things, lots of tunnels. The really annoying thing about this is Australia needs this project, right? This project alone can power 3 million homes for almost a week. You're not going to do that with a battery in the foreseeable future. That's just not going to happen. So we need it to help us transition, but it's been, I could slip into French here about our politicians, but it's been royally stuffed up in the last few years. Now, it started out as being a $2 billion project. Then that was adjusted up to $4 billion. In 2019, $5 billion. Now the cost is being spoken about being in the order of $12 billion, and also a massive blowout in time. People have also forgotten to talk about the 2 new interconnector systems which we need to connect it to the grid, which alone have blown out in cost and will be something like $10 to $12 billion. And because of the delays in the project, and no one talks about this one, we're going to have to keep some rather large coal power stations going for perhaps another 5 to 10 years, and who knows what the cost of that is. Let's just call it $5 billion for a round number. So the cost of this project has gone from something like $2 billion up to about $30 billion. Why? What is one of the fundamental causes? The tunnel boring machine's been stuck for about 18 metres. It's gotten 150 metres into the tunnel and it hasn't moved ever since, which is adding all of the cost delays, etc. Why is it stuck? No one knew what rocks are in front of it, right? There was a total lack of internet of geosensing, if you like. And the quotes I've put there on the slide are taken directly from people talking about the project on that Four Corners show. If you're talking about a return on investment, the value of information, the value of all body knowledge, perhaps $1 million worth of drilling. Maybe if it was $5 million worth of drilling and data acquisition, could have prevented a $28 billion blowout and time blowout as well on this project. I think that puts anything we've done in mining, actual mining, into the shade, but it's just an example of gathering data at the right time to inform projects, to reduce risk, is just a critical problem with all of these projects. And here's another tunnel, and I put this here for two reasons. This is the channel back from 1990. Now, if the Snowy scheme ends up, Snowy 2 ends up costing $30 billion in inflation-adjusted terms, the whole channel tunnel costs $35 billion. So that's the orders that we're talking about now to complete this Snowy Hydro 2 scheme. The other interesting fact there, and the other reason I put it up there, is that IMDEX provided the technology to line up the last 100 metres of the two tunnels as they were approaching each other from across, from France and from England, of course, because we were the only company that had sensing technology that was accurate to 1 in 1,000, which is what they needed for the last bit of those tunnels when they were joining them up, rather than 1 in 100. Anyway, so it's an interesting story, but it segues back nicely. Let's talk a little bit more about value of information. This is a slide I made a while ago. Some researchers over at UBC in Vancouver, University of British Columbia. So Andrew was a PhD student working with Michael, and John Steen was the academic over there. Andrew did a PhD and he went back through press releases and ASX and TSX announcements looking at the magnitudes of balance sheet write-downs or direct financial write-downs and adding them all up and trying to attribute those to a cause. And with that, in his PhD, what he identified was fully 1/3 of the write-downs didn't need to happen, right? They're a bit like the Snowy project scheme. They were related to a lack of technical information or geological information collected at the right time before these things were put into production. Now that's interesting, and that was a while ago. We've seen some recent examples just here in the last few months, these balance sheet write-downs. Now, you can argue whether some of these things are due to geotechnical, geological, modelling, spatial variable type issues. It doesn't really matter. The thing is they keep happening in the industry, and the industry seems to tolerate it. It's almost a normalcy of deviant behaviour, if you like, in our industry. Do they need to happen? What is the scale of the investment needed early on in a project's life to avoid these sorts of write-downs in the first place? To address this, IMDEX and working with IDEON and the guys at the University of British Columbia, Broome School and the MDRU, we've initiated a project to actually calculate the dollar value of information. What is the dollar value of collecting that information or adopting that technology? One of the reasons, and of course we supply technology into the industry, one of the reasons we think we have trouble getting the industry to sometimes adopt new technologies and therefore avoid some of these problems is that we can't articulate in dollars what the value of what we are trying to do is, right? Now that's a problem for us, the service side of the industry. It's also a problem for the people inside the resource companies that we're talking to, because ultimately they need to articulate the dollar value of what they're trying to do to their bosses as well. You know, money, dollars are the the global language when you're trying to get technology adopted. We don't use it enough, right? And we simply have to get better at doing that. The other thing we're going to look at this project is a quote that comes out of that upstream book, which I'd recommend to everyone, especially the operators of the Snowy project, for example, is the multiple pockets problem. So, you know, we go to an operation, we expect one part of the operation to pay and change a workflow to adopt a technology and use it. But the information that's generated accrues somewhere else in the mining operation. The benefit accrues to them. So they're in separate budget pools. Now, so therefore it's a barrier to adoption. Now that sounds a bit silly, but it's just a fact of life. But if we can start to articulate what we're doing in dollars and get it to the right levels of management within the resource companies, it has a much better chance of succeeding and being adopted, and also surviving when the cost cuts come, because we're a cyclical industry. So just a little bit on technology. This is the Blast Dog. Some of you would have heard about this before. This is really a tactical Internet of Geosensing system. And here it is in operation. It's sped up just a bit. But it's a system that runs around on the bench and puts down what is possibly the ultimate Internet of Geosensing system down blast holes to measure all sorts of properties about the hole itself, but also geological properties around the rocks that surround the blast hole. It's semi-autonomous. Someone's sitting in the truck there running it by remote control. It does a lot of the steps along the process in an autonomous mode, like finding the hole and deploying the tool. It collects a whole lot of information at one pass. It has a very rapid logging speed. It can keep up with blast hole drilling. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details there. There are multiple sensors on that thing. One of them is conductivity. Let's go ahead. Why measure conductivity? Because conductivity measures the clay content. Why measure the clay content? Because the clay content affects copper recoveries, right? As simple as that. Now, what is the value of that? What is the value of understanding where the clay is distributed on a bench given a particular mine site? This is some data from a single copper concentrator in a large open cut porphyry deposit. At the time, that single concentrator was producing $2 billion worth of copper concentrate per annum. It would be more than that now given the current copper prices, and there were 4 of them. Now, if you have a look, the graphs on the right-hand side there show the throughput and recovery. And something's happened, you know, something's happened to the throughput, something's happened to the recovery. What they think was the cause of that was clay entering the circuit, clay being brought up and entering the circuit, which can affect both throughput and your copper recovery. The combined effect of both of those was to drop the production of that single concentrator by 16% over that 12-month period. Now, you can do the maths of 16% of $2 billion of copper concentrate, which, by the way, you never get back. Right? It disappears out to the tail, and you don't get it in that financial year either. Now, the Blast Dog, used in a tactical Internet of Geosensing sense, will let you know where the clay is, and you can make tactical decisions about how to control that, stockpile it separately, blend it in, things like that. But if you don't have the data, you can't make those decisions, and you're faced with just throwing it in the mill and having these undesirable things happen. In a previous life, I was a process control instrument technician working in an oil refinery. So these sorts of thoughts appeal to me. And another simple way of looking at tactical use of the Internet of Geosensing is to kill variability. Variability is the enemy in everything, including mining operations. And the simple plots there show that if you kill the variability, you can turn the set point up and get more stuff out the other end. There couldn't be a more simpler bloody concept. No, it really couldn't. So, but it's not a concept that gets really thought through, nor valued, because it often doesn't have a dollar value put on it, which I find quite confusing in the industry, but we're here to try and promote this and get it changed. This is just another example. That was a tactical use of the Internet of Geosensing. There's also a strategic use of the Internet of Geosensing. This is some work that we did with DataRock, our partners at IMDEX, at a copper deposit in the north of WA. And there's a lot of details in there, but just to summarise it for you, for a small investment during the resource drill out definition phase, they were able to more precisely define the oxide-sulfide boundary, which meant that the error, the misclassification rates, false positive, false negative classification rates were reduced. We can model all of that and look at the effect of it over time. It cost $5 million. In fact, it's probably an estimate to generate the data. It probably costs $3 million. But nevertheless, when you run the maths over it, it led to an increase in the project NPV of about a quarter. The IRR improved by 2%, from 16 to 18%. Reduced the decision to build the operation in the first place. Maybe you shouldn't build the mine, but it reduced the probability of that being wrong by 5%. And overall, it created an NPV value of 80 million over the life of mine of that project. Not a particularly big project, nor a long one. But these are, we go in and say, get this data, scan these rocks, generate that. Why? What's the value? Put a number on it, right? Put a number on it and do it properly. And this brings around another challenge for the industry, and it's been spoken about briefly already. There are more and more Internet of Geosensing systems coming onto the market, and we're going to suffer from the 3 Vs. We're going to have a high velocity of data, a high variety of data, and a ginormous volume of data to deal with. I don't know if we're quite set up to deal with it yet. And if you do the numbers and you look at all the drilling that's done in the world, if 10% of that drilling was scanned using some of the new Internet of Geosensing systems, which are capable of generating a gigabyte of data per metre, we would generate 50,000 petabytes of data that we would need to deal with in the minerals industry. We're starting to make the oil and gas industry look like poor cousins with data storage and processing. I'm not quite sure if we're quite ready for that yet. And I think, although the data has value, no one's articulating it, right? So if there's anything that's like the sun coming up, if you're generating scads and scads and cads of data and you can't show the value, the mining operation will throw it back off-site, right? It's not the technology's fault, it's just because you haven't illustrated what the value is that can be created from it, nor translated it into a dollar value. And just to finish off, those slides, and we've heard this before, imply that we need a very, very clever and very agile workforce. That graph there just illustrates that the mining, the metalliferous industries are even less desirable to go into for young people than oil and gas, which is frankly gobsmacking and embarrassing. I'm not quite sure how we've made it that bad for ourselves, but as an industry, we complained a lot about this, but I think it's time we started to do something and cooperate around it. And how on earth it got to this point, I'm not sure. When the only non-military pilot type that's been to the moon and set foot on the moon was actually a geologist. So how geology's actually gotten to this point, in the way it's viewed generally and in the community, I'm just not quite sure. So there's some repair to be done. And that's it. So thank you very much.